He sat alone in the corner booth, same table every morning for 6 years. Other customers whispered about the dangerous old man and changed tables when he walked in. The barista had strict orders. Serve him quickly, don't make conversation, and call security if he seemed unstable. What none of them knew was that the quiet stranger sipping black coffee had once carried 5 wounded soldiers through 2 miles of enemy fire to save their lives. Welcome to Warrior Voice. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world you are watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The morning routine at Rosie's Coffee Corner had become as predictable as sunrise. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the bell above the door would chime with its familiar brass tone, and Chen would enter, moving with the careful precision of a man who had learned that sudden movements made people nervous. He was 73 years old, thin from years of poor eating and government assistance meals, with graying hair that he kept short in the military style that had never left him despite 5 decades of civilian life. His clothes were clean but worn, the same 3 shirts rotated weekly, washed by hand in his small apartment sink because the laundromat was an expense he couldn't always afford. The other customers had long since established their unspoken protocol, a silent choreography of avoidance that played out every morning. When Robert entered, conversations would lower to whispers, coffee cups would pause halfway to lips, and newspapers would rise like shields. Parents would casually guide their children to tables farther away, explaining in hushed tones that some people needed space. Business people would suddenly discover urgent phone calls that required them to step outside, their conversations mysteriously resuming once the old veteran had settled into his corner booth. Even the regular customers who had been coming to Rosie's for years would find reasons to finish their coffee quickly and leave, checking their watches as if suddenly remembering important appointments. Sarah Martinez, the 19-year-old barista, had been working at Rosie's for 8 months when she first encountered the elaborate social dance surrounding Table 7. She was a sophomore at the local community college, working part-time to pay for textbooks and help her single mother with rent. Coffee shop work was supposed to be simple: take orders, make drinks, smile at customers. But on her first day, her manager, Dave, had pulled her aside for a special briefing about the corner booth and the man who occupied it every morning. "Listen carefully," Dave had said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience managing downtown coffee shops. He glanced toward the corner booth, empty at the time, but somehow still carrying an aura of caution. "That guy in the corner? His name is Robert something, Chen I think. He's a Vietnam vet. Comes in every morning at exactly 7:15, orders black coffee, sits alone for exactly 30 minutes. Here's what you need to know. Don't engage in conversation beyond basic service, serve him quickly and efficiently, and if he starts acting strange or talking about the war or getting agitated, you call me immediately. These guys can be unpredictable. PTSD, flashbacks. They can snap without warning." Sarah had nodded, accepting this guidance without question. She was new to customer service, new to the working world, and Dave had been managing coffee shops for 15 years. If he said the old man was potentially dangerous, she believed him. The weight of responsibility felt heavy on her young shoulders. She was being trusted to handle a delicate situation to keep other customers safe while still providing service to someone who clearly needed to be watched carefully. For months, Sarah had followed the protocol exactly. When Robert entered, she would quickly prepare his black coffee. No sugar, no cream, no modifications, always the same, and deliver it to Table 7 with minimal interaction. Her movements were efficient but cautious, like someone approaching a wild animal that might startle. "Here's your coffee, sir," she would say, setting it down without making eye contact, then hurrying back to the safety of the counter where she could observe from a distance. Robert never complained about the service. He never asked for conversation, never questioned the abrupt delivery or the lack of warmth. He would simply nod his thanks, a slight incline of his head that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and dignity. then sip his coffee slowly while reading yesterday's newspaper that he collected from park benches and bus stops. He moved deliberately, each gesture measured and careful, as if he understood that any sudden motion might alarm the other customers. After exactly 30 minutes, he would leave, placing a $5 bill on the table, far more than necessary for a $2.50 cup of coffee. A tip that spoke of someone who understood the value of kindness even when it wasn't returned. The other customers had developed their own theories about Robert, whispered speculations that grew more elaborate with each telling. Mrs. Patterson, a retired school teacher who came in every Tuesday with her book club, was convinced he was mentally unstable. "You can see it in his eyes," she would whisper to her friends, leaning forward conspiratorially over their lattes. "That 1,000-yard stare they talk about. He probably has flashbacks and everything. I read an article about how Vietnam veterans have higher rates of violence and unpredictable behavior. We should be careful." Tom Bradley, a successful real estate agent who held his morning meetings at Rosie's, had a different theory. "I've dealt with enough troubled people to recognize the signs," he would tell his clients, gesturing discreetly toward the corner booth. "That guy's probably homeless, maybe an addict. Vietnam vets have high rates of substance abuse, drug problems, alcohol problems. The VA system is completely broken, so these guys end up on the streets. He's probably here because it's warm and he can nurse 1 cup of coffee for an hour." Even the younger customers, college students and young professionals who frequented Rosie's for its free Wi-Fi and trendy atmosphere, had their opinions. "My psychology professor says Vietnam veterans have higher rates of PTSD and violent behavior." A pre-med student named Jake had explained to his study group one morning, speaking in the confident tone of someone who had read a textbook chapter on post-traumatic stress. "It makes perfect sense that people would be cautious around them. Better safe than sorry, right?" None of them had ever spoken to Robert. None of them knew his name, his story, his background, or anything about him beyond the basic fact that he was a Vietnam veteran who sat alone. But their assumptions had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that surrounded Table 7 like an invisible barrier, as real and impermeable as any physical wall. Robert was acutely aware of their discomfort, of course. He had been living with that reaction for over 50 years, ever since he returned from Southeast Asia in 1971 to a country that treated its Vietnam veterans like walking reminders of a failed war. He had learned to expect the suspicious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when he drew near, the way parents would shield their children from him, as if his mere presence might contaminate their innocence. He had grown accustomed to the wide berth people gave him in grocery stores, the way job interviews would end abruptly when his military service was mentioned, the assumption that his silence was menacing rather than respectful. But Rosie's coffee corner was his refuge, perhaps the only place in his carefully circumscribed world where he could sit quietly with his memories and his coffee without being completely alone. He didn't come for the company. He had given up on that decades ago, after too many failed attempts at connection had ended in disappointment or rejection. He came for the routine, for the familiar sounds of the espresso machine hissing and grinding, for the quiet hum of morning conversation that served as a backdrop to his solitude, even if that conversation stopped when he entered. The newspaper he read each morning wasn't current. Robert couldn't afford a daily subscription on his modest disability pension. Instead, he collected discarded papers from park benches and bus stops, reading day-old news while sipping his coffee. It didn't matter that the information was outdated. Reading helped him focus on the present, helped quiet the voices from the past that sometimes grew too loud in the silence of his small studio apartment. The sports scores from yesterday, the weather forecasts that had already passed, the political debates that had moved on to new controversies. All of it served as a kind of meditation, a way to anchor himself in the mundane present, rather than drift back to memories that could still make his hands shake. Sarah had begun to notice things about Robert that her training hadn't prepared her for. She noticed that he always thanked her politely, that he never made a mess at his table, that he seemed to go out of his way to avoid disturbing other customers. She noticed that his hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, not from anger or instability as she had been warned, but from what looked like old injuries or perhaps early arthritis. She noticed the careful way he counted out his money, the methodical way he folded his newspaper, the respectful distance he maintained from other customers. Most importantly, she noticed that he seemed incredibly sad. Not dangerous, not unstable, not unpredictable, just profoundly, quietly sad, like someone carrying a weight that was too heavy to share. The shift in Sarah's perspective began on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Robert had entered at his usual time, but something was different. He moved more slowly than usual, favoring his right leg, and when he sat down, she could see him wince as if in pain. When Sarah brought his coffee, she couldn't help but notice that his newspaper was 3 days old and that the hands holding it trembled more than usual. There was something vulnerable about him that morning, something that broke through her carefully maintained professional distance. "Here's your coffee, sir," she said, following her usual script. "Thank you, miss," Robert replied as he always did. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. But this time, instead of hurrying away, Sarah hesitated. Something about his obvious discomfort, the way he sat so carefully, made her forget her training for a moment. Are you feeling all right today?" she asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. Robert looked up, surprised by the unexpected question. For a moment, his eyes met hers directly for the first time in 8 months of daily interactions, and Sarah saw something there that contradicted everything she had been told about dangerous, unstable veterans. She saw kindness, gentleness, and a deep, profound weariness that spoke of decades of carrying burdens alone. "Just an old injury acting up," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a slight rasp from years of smoking and shouting over helicopter engines decades ago. "Nothing to worry about, miss. Thank you for asking." Sarah nodded and returned to the counter, but something had shifted in her understanding. For the first time, she had seen Robert as a person rather than a potential threat, as someone who might be hurting rather than someone who might hurt others. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to pay closer attention to Robert's routine, observing him with new eyes. She noticed that he came in every morning regardless of weather, through November rain, December snow, and January ice storms, suggesting that Rosie's might be one of the few consistent sources of warmth and human contact in his life. She noticed that he always ordered the same thing, not out of stubbornness or inflexibility as she had assumed, but likely because it was all he could afford on what was probably a fixed income. She noticed that he read his outdated newspapers with careful attention, as if staying informed about the world was important to him, despite his isolation from it. The other employees maintained their distance, still following Dave's original instructions. Janet, the afternoon shift manager, had her own stories about unpredictable veterans. Marcus, the weekend barista, had been told the same warnings. The customers continued their whispered theories and careful avoidance. But Sarah found herself questioning the assumptions that had guided her behavior for so many months. The turning point came on a busy Friday morning in December, when the coffee shop was packed with the usual mix of commuters grabbing coffee before work, students settling in for study sessions, and regular customers claiming their favorite tables. The air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, filled with the comfortable buzz of morning conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Robert had taken his place at table 7, quietly reading a week-old sports section while sipping his black coffee, maintaining his usual invisible presence in the corner. A group of college students had claimed the large table near the window, spreading out textbooks and laptops for what appeared to be a study session. They were discussing their American history class, specifically a unit on the Vietnam War that was clearly part of their required curriculum. Their voices carried across the coffee shop with the confidence of young people who had never questioned their right to express their opinions freely. "I just don't understand how we got involved in such a pointless conflict," said a young woman named Emily, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had read several textbook chapters on the subject. It was basically American imperialism disguised as anti-communism. We had no business being there in the first place." Her study partner, a young man named Chris, nodded in agreement, highlighting passages in his textbook with a bright yellow marker. "And the soldiers who went over there were mostly poor kids who couldn't get out of the draft. They probably didn't even understand what they were fighting for. Just following orders without thinking about the bigger picture. My grandfather always said Vietnam veterans came back all messed up," added another student, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and expensive-looking clothes. "Like, psychologically damaged. He said you couldn't trust them because the war broke their minds. They couldn't adjust to normal society." Sarah glanced toward table 7 and saw Robert's shoulders tense slightly. His newspaper remained in front of his face, but she could tell he was listening to every word. His coffee cup sat untouched, growing cold as the conversation continued. The discussion among the students grew more animated as they discussed their assignment, each trying to demonstrate their understanding of the historical and political complexities of the Vietnam era. "I heard a lot of them became homeless or addicted to drugs," Emily continued, reading from her notes. "Like, they couldn't adjust to normal life after all the violence. They had PTSD and anger issues and couldn't hold down jobs." "Makes sense," Chris replied, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of youth. "If you spend years killing people in a jungle, how do you come back and work a normal job? How do you relate to normal people who haven't experienced that kind of trauma? Plus, the whole war was basically a mistake," added the third student. "So they came back knowing they'd fought for nothing. That has to mess with your head." Sarah watched Robert carefully fold his newspaper and place it on the table with deliberate precision. His movements were controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with age or injury. He stood slowly, left his usual $5 tip on the table, and began walking toward the door without finishing his coffee, something she had never seen him do before in 8 months of daily observation. As Robert passed the students' table, one of them looked up and noticed him. The conversation stopped abruptly as they registered his age, his military bearing, and the obvious fact that he had been within earshot of their entire discussion. The realization that they had been discussing Vietnam veterans in the presence of what was clearly a Vietnam veteran created an awkward silence that spread across their table like spilled coffee. Emily flushed red, suddenly realizing the implications of their conversation. "Oh, I'm sorry. We didn't mean." Robert stopped and turned to face them. His expression wasn't angry or threatening, just infinitely tired. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying the weight of decades of similar encounters. "It's all right," he said simply. "You're entitled to your opinions." He continued toward the door, but Chris called after him, motivated by a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. "Sir, wait, were you in Vietnam?" Robert paused with his hand on the door handle. For a long moment he didn't respond, and Sarah could see him struggling with something internal, the decision of whether to engage or simply leave. Then he turned back toward the students, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Not anger, not instability, but infinite sadness mixed with a kind of resigned dignity. "Yes," Robert said simply. "I was." The coffee shop had gone completely quiet. Every conversation had stopped, every customer was watching, and even the espresso machine seemed to pause in its constant hissing. The weight of the moment settled over the room like a blanket, heavy with the understanding that something significant was about to happen. "I was a medic with the 1st Cavalry Division," Robert continued, his voice steady but soft, each word carefully chosen. "I spent 13 months in country, from March 1970 to April 1971. I treated wounded soldiers, American and Vietnamese both. I watched 19-year-old boys die calling for their mothers. I carried wounded men through jungles while being shot at by people who look like children themselves." The students stared at him, their textbook discussions and academic theories suddenly seeming inadequate and embarrassing in the face of lived experience. "I came home to people calling me a baby killer and a psychopath," Robert said, his voice growing slightly stronger. "I was spit on in airports, refused service in restaurants, turned away from jobs because employers thought I was unstable. For 50 years, I've lived with people crossing the street when they see me coming, whispering about how dangerous I am, treating me like I'm one bad day away from snapping. Sarah felt tears building in her eyes as she listened to Robert speak. This wasn't the dangerous, unstable veteran she had been warned about. This was a man who had served his country and spent the rest of his life paying for it, carrying the weight of both his service and society's rejection. But you know what? Robert continued, and for the first time, there was something approaching fire in his voice. I'd do it again. Because those boys I carried out of the jungle got to come home to their families. They got to have children and grandchildren and normal lives. They got to grow old in peace. And that's worth more than people thinking well of me. He turned back toward the door, then paused one more time, as if deciding whether to say more. For what it's worth, he said to the students, his voice returning to its quiet register. You're right about some things. A lot of us did come back broken. A lot of us did struggle with drugs and homelessness and unemployment. But it wasn't because we were weak or because war made us crazy. It was because the country we served decided we were embarrassments to be hidden away rather than people who needed help. Robert left then, the door chiming behind him as he walked out into the cold December morning, leaving behind a coffee shop full of people who suddenly felt very small. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. The students sat frozen, their textbooks and highlighters and confident opinions suddenly seeming like inadequate tools for understanding the human cost of the historical events they had been casually discussing. Emily stared at her notebook, where she had written, Vietnam vets equals PTSD, violence, drugs in neat handwriting. Chris looked at his textbook chapter on the failed war in Southeast Asia and realized that the failure wasn't just political or military, it was moral, social, and deeply personal. Sarah stared at the door through which Robert had left, feeling ashamed of the months she had spent treating him like a potential threat rather than a customer deserving of basic human respect. Around the coffee shop, other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of their own assumptions and prejudices. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat uncomfortably, gathering her book club materials as if suddenly needing to be somewhere else. Tom Bradley stared into his coffee cup, his theories about homeless addicts seeming cruel and ignorant in the light of Robert's quiet dignity. The other customers began quietly gathering their things, the morning's comfortable routine disrupted by an uncomfortable truth. That afternoon, during her break, Sarah approached Dave with a mixture of nervousness and determination. I want to ask you about Robert, she said. The Vietnam veteran who comes in every morning. Dave looked up from the inventory he was checking, his expression immediately cautious. What about him? He's not causing problems, is he? I told you to be careful around him. No, Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. That's just it. He's never caused problems. He's polite, quiet, and he tips well. So why do we treat him like he's dangerous? Dave sighed, setting down his clipboard. Look, Sarah, I know it seems harsh, but you have to understand. Vietnam vets have issues. PTSD, anger problems, substance abuse. I've seen it before. I managed a coffee shop in Portland where a vet had a flashback and started throwing chairs. It's better to be safe than sorry. But have you ever actually talked to him? Sarah asked. Have you ever asked him about his service or his life or what he needs? I don't need to, Dave replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had made up his mind years ago. I know the statistics. I know the risks. My job is to keep this place safe for customers and employees. Sarah realized that Dave's attitude was exactly what Robert had been describing, assumptions based on stereotypes and fear rather than actual experience with the individual person. I think we should treat him better, Sarah said. He's a customer and he's a veteran. He deserves our respect. Dave shrugged. Do what you want, but don't come crying to me if there's a problem, and don't expect me to change the policy. The next Monday morning, Sarah was working alone when Robert entered at his usual time. The weekend had given her time to think about their conversation, about his dignity in the face of decades of prejudice, about the courage it must have taken to speak up to those students. Instead of simply preparing his coffee and delivering it with minimal interaction, she decided to try something different. "Good morning, Robert," she said when he approached the counter. He looked surprised, almost startled. It was the first time anyone at Rosie's had used his name, the first time he had been acknowledged as an individual rather than simply the Vietnam vet. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice nervous but sincere. "I realized I've been serving you for months without ever properly introducing myself. I'm Sarah." Robert studied her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether this was genuine kindness or some kind of setup, another test to navigate carefully. "Good morning, Sarah," he said carefully, his voice carrying a note of cautious hope. "Thank you. Would you like your usual black coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please." As Sarah prepared his coffee, taking more care than usual to ensure it was perfect, she took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "Robert," she said, "I want to apologize for the way I've treated you. I was told you might be dangerous because you're a Vietnam veteran, and I believed that without ever getting to know you as a person. That was wrong of me." Robert's expression softened slightly, surprise and something that might have been gratitude flickering across his weathered features. "You don't need to apologize, miss," he said quietly. "You were just following orders. I understand that." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But that doesn't make it right. You've been nothing but polite and respectful every single day, and I should have recognized that instead of treating you like a threat." She handed him his coffee, and for the first time in 8 months of daily interactions, she looked directly into his eyes. "Thank you for your service," she said simply. Robert's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Sarah realized that these might be the first words of genuine appreciation he had heard regarding his military service in decades. The simple phrase that she had heard others say casually carried enormous weight when spoken with sincerity to someone who had never heard it before. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know." Robert made his way to table 7, but something fundamental had changed. The invisible barrier of fear and suspicion that had surrounded him for so long had developed its first crack, and light was beginning to seep through. Over the following weeks, Sarah began treating Robert like any other valued customer. She would greet him by name when he entered, ask about his day, and occasionally recommend items from the menu. She learned that he lived alone in a small apartment 6 blocks away, that he survived on a modest disability pension, supplemented by occasional odd jobs, and that his daily coffee at Rosie's was one of his few regular social interactions. More importantly, she learned that Robert was one of the kindest, most thoughtful people she had ever met. He remembered details about her college classes and would ask about her exams. He noticed when she seemed tired or stressed and would quietly leave larger tips on those days. When she mentioned that she was struggling with her statistics homework, he offered to help, revealing a sharp mind and patience that made complex concepts suddenly clear. He never spoke about his war experiences unless asked, and when he did, it was always with a focus on the men he had served with, rather than his own actions. He talked about Johnny from Detroit, who loved baseball, about Miguel from Texas, who carried pictures of his 3 sisters, about Thompson from Oregon, who could fix any piece of equipment with wire and determination. He spoke of them with love and loss, carrying their memories like precious cargo. The other customers began to notice the change in Sarah's behavior toward Robert, and gradually, some of them began to question their own assumptions. Mrs. Patterson, who had been convinced Robert was unstable, overheard him quietly helping Sarah with a crossword puzzle one morning and realized he was quite intelligent and well-read. She began to reconsider her theories about dangerous veterans. Tom Bradley watched Robert help an elderly woman who had fallen outside the coffee shop, supporting her gently and staying with her until paramedics arrived, and began to reconsider his assumptions about homeless addicts. The college students who had discussed the Vietnam War returned to Rosie's several times, clearly hoping for another encounter with Robert. When they finally worked up the courage to approach his table, they found him willing to discuss his experiences, not as a victim or a stereotype, but as someone who had lived through history and had stories to share. 3 months after Sarah's apology, Robert's routine at Rosie's had been completely transformed. Other customers would nod and greet him when he entered. The morning regulars had learned his name and would include him in their casual conversations. Children no longer shied away from him. Instead, they were fascinated by his stories about different countries and cultures. Dave, the manager who had originally established the protocol of caution around Robert, watched these changes with grudging admission that his assumptions had been wrong, though he never formally changed his policy or apologized. One morning in March, Sarah arrived at work to find an envelope waiting for her, with her name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter from Robert, written on plain white paper in the precise script of someone who had learned to write before computers existed. "Dear Sarah," it read, "I wanted you to know that your kindness over these past months has meant everything to me. For most of my adult life, I've felt invisible, like a reminder of a war people wanted to forget. I've carried the weight of my service and my country's rejection for 50 years, believing that I was destined to live and die alone. But you saw me as a person worth knowing, and that changed everything. Because of you, I no longer dread leaving my apartment each morning. I look forward to coming to Rosie's, not just for the coffee, but for the human connection I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me back my dignity, and I will never forget that. Thank you for treating an old soldier like he mattered. With gratitude and respect, Robert Chen, Medic, 1st Cavalry Division, United States Army." Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She realized that her simple decision to treat Robert with basic human respect had transformed not just his daily experience, but her own understanding of what it meant to see people as individuals, rather than stereotypes. When Robert entered that morning, Sarah was ready with his coffee and something else, a small American flag pin that she had bought for him at a local gift shop. "I thought you might like this," she said, pinning it to his jacket with careful hands. Robert looked down at the flag, then back at Sarah. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long time since I felt proud to wear this." As Robert made his way to table 7, no longer a place of isolation, but a spot where friends knew they could find him, Sarah realized that she had learned something important about the power of simple human kindness. The morning rush continued around them, but everything had changed. Robert Chen was no longer the dangerous Vietnam veteran to be avoided. He was simply Robert, a regular customer, a friend, and a reminder that everyone has a story worth hearing if we take the time to listen. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with understanding. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields, but in coffee shops, where a young woman's decision to see past stereotypes can restore an old soldier's faith in humanity. Robert Chen never asked for recognition or gratitude. He just wanted to drink his coffee in peace. But when someone finally took the time to see him as a human being, rather than a cautionary tale, it reminded everyone in that coffee shop that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and that the greatest service we can provide to our veterans is the simple gift of respect. This story was brought to you by Warrior Voice. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know their story? Tell us in the comments about a time when you discovered that your first impression was wrong. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.